I'll invite Michelle Davis on up to the podium. Michelle is one of our many workers with the Christian Missionary Alliance. We have over 700 workers in tons of countries around the world, and the job of the Alliance, that we've made it our job, is to reach people who are the least reached. And Michelle has been faithfully working and serving with the Alliance for several years, and recently she's come pretty close and is in New York City now. So welcome, Michelle Davis.
Thank you. Thank you for having me this morning. I love seeing these shoeboxes because as I was growing up in CMA churches, I packed many shoeboxes, but then when we were living overseas in Senegal for many years, we got to be on the end of distributing shoeboxes to our neighbors and to people in our community that we were reaching out to, and it is super exciting to be able to do that part of it. So thank you for the shoeboxes. They do make a significant impact overseas, all over the world. So, what happens if you squeeze a jelly donut? What happens? Jelly comes out, that's right. And what happens if you squeeze a Boston cream donut? Cream comes out, exactly. But what happens if the jelly donut has been sitting on the counter for a long time, or way too long in the fridge, maybe a really long time, and it starts to mold? Well, if you're going to squeeze that donut, mold and jelly are going to come out. And you see, pressure reveals what's on the inside. So when you squeeze that donut and it's a fresh donut, you get fresh jelly. When you squeeze it and it's an old donut, you don't get fresh jelly anymore. So I want to tell you a story about a man who faced a lot of pressure, persecution, in fact. His name is Philip, and we find his story in the book of Acts. Maybe I didn't turn it on. I think I turned it on. How do I get this to go? I don't think it's... There we go. Okay. Oops. Sorry, I went too far. I'm going to go back. Okay. So just before we jump into Philip's story, let's consider the background a little bit. So in the book of Acts, Jesus ascends up into heaven. The disciples are waiting in Jerusalem because he said, wait for me, I'm going to send the Holy Spirit, and then you can go out. So they're waiting in Jerusalem, and then Pentecost comes, right? And they're filled with the Holy Spirit. And there's healing of many people, and then Peter and John are arrested. The believers are living together, they're sharing all their possessions, they're fellowshipping together. But then the apostles start to get arrested. And it's in this setting that we first hear about Philip. We first see him in Acts chapter 6, verse 3. You see, what was happening is the apostles more and more people were becoming followers of Jesus. And so the apostles were stretched, and they didn't have time to take care of the widows and take care of the needs of the people while also preaching the word, healing people. And so they appointed 7 people, and these 7 people were chosen to take care of the growing needs of the church. And Philip was among them. Interestingly, the people that were chosen were people who were known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. And their job each day when the people gathered, they would take care of the widows, they would wait on tables. They were serving this very small but rapidly growing church. One day, Stephen, who was one of the 7, was arrested, and ultimately he was martyred, as you know. And after that day, persecution started toward all the believers, and they were scattered. And so Philip was scattered up to Samaria. And so Philip is facing a tremendous amount of pressure, probably a great amount of stress. He was just displaced from his home, and he finds himself in a new place, a new city. It's as if you had to move tomorrow or this afternoon, and you find yourself in a totally different place that you've never lived before. When the pressures applied to Philip, what do we find? we find him preaching the word boldly in Samaria and healing people. He's casting out demons. He's healing people who are paralyzed and who are crippled. In fact, a revival starts in Samaria. Philip is so filled with the Spirit that when pressure comes, just like the jelly donut, when pressure comes, what oozes out of him? It's the Holy Spirit and what God has done in his life. And so he's preaching with power and he's healing people. And what's inside him is affecting the entire environment around him. In fact, all of Samaria. What do people see when the pressure is applied to us? Are we overflowing with the Spirit? Or are there mold and other things that are coming out of our lives? How are we affecting the environments around us? Wow, it's been really convicting to me these last few weeks as I've been wrestling through this time, preparing for this. Because if you could ask my kids, my husband, they will tell you that it's not always all pretty what's coming out when the pressure's pressed on me. However, as we continue to surrender and yield to the Holy Spirit's working and his refining, his pruning in our lives, we become more and more like Jesus. So more and more of Jesus is flowing out of us. So this revival is going on in Samaria. And then we read in Acts 8:26, now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, God speaks. He speaks to Philip, and he's speaking to us. God communicates. Why does he communicate? He wants to be in relationship with us. He wants to interact with us. He wants to talk with us, and he wants us to talk with him. He also has important things to tell us. He's got invitations. He's got things he wants us to be involved in, things that we can join him in. And so he speaks. And we see this all throughout history, right? We see Moses in the burning bush. We see Balaam's donkey who talks. We see many prophets in the Old Testament. And we hear that Jesus says that his sheep hear his voice. They know it, and they follow it. Several years ago, I had a funny situation happen. We were living in Nyack during our home assignment at the time. And I was in a McDonald's drive-through line, one of those crazy days where a lot was happening, and I just needed to grab lunch for my child who was maybe 5 at the time. And we were in the line. It was lunch, so it was packed. There were tons of people in the line. And as I came around to pay, I sensed the Lord say to me, pray for the lady who you're coming up to. And I said, God, this is the McDonald's drive-through line. There's a lot of people behind me. It's lunch. People are in a hurry. And he said, pray for her. And I said, I'll pray for her, like while I'm driving to her. How does that work for you? And I said, pray for her with her. And I didn't do it. I said, thank you. I was kind of friendly. And I kept driving. And I was about half a mile down the road. And my son said to me, Mom, I wanted nuggets too. I changed my mind. It wasn't just French fries I wanted. And normally I would say, sorry, you said French fries, no nuggets, we're already running late, here we go. And I said, wow, you know what? Today is a really great day for me to get nuggets for you because I am going back because God told me to pray for this lady and we're going to pray for her on the second time around. So I went back to McDonald's, got back in the drive-through line, which was even longer at this point. I placed my order. I got up, the lady recognized me. I mean, it had been 10 minutes. And I said, yeah, I'm back. How can I pray for you? The Lord said that I should pray for you, and I would like to pray for you. And she burst into tears, and she told me this story about her son who was struggling. And I prayed for her, and I continued on in my day. I love when God speaks, and sometimes it's easy to be obedient, and sometimes it's just not that easy. And sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we don't, and that's okay. Mind you, several months later, I went through the McDonald's drive-thru again. I try not to make it a habit. In fact, I rarely go there. But I went through the McDonald's drive-thru again, and the lady was there, and she recognized me. And she said, you've been praying for me. I know you have, because things are turning around in my son's life. And I said, God, you know what you're doing. You know what you're doing when you tell us to do things. We can trust you. More recently, a few months ago, the Lord I was wrestling with our new ministry. I was trying to figure out what my role was. Where's my place? I had taken a while to figure it out when we were living overseas in Senegal, and had finally found my kind of sweet spot and was just struggling to figure out where is my sweet spot in New York City. And the Lord just said, I'm going to open new things for you. There'll be new things. And I said, well, what are the new things? And he said, I'll tell you. I'll tell you over time. So one of the new things in my season right now has been teaching ESL to some West African ladies, and the Lord just opened this really, really cool connection. So it's beautiful when the Lord speaks and we hear his voice, we cultivate listening, and we obey. So let's go back to our story for a minute. What does the angel tell Philip to do? God tells Philip to start walking, to go south on a road, the desert road that goes from Jerusalem down into Gaza. He's very specific. He says, take this road, it goes out of Jerusalem, not down into Gaza. So here on this slide, we can see, so the one, if you can see it, is his first journey, so when he's scattered. So Paul's persecuted, and he's in Jerusalem with all the believers, and then he goes up to Samaria, and other believers go other places. But now he's up in Samaria, and God says, go back down to Jerusalem, and then continue down this desert road. In several commentaries, I read that there were 2 roads that led south from Jerusalem. And God told Philip to take the one that was less traveled. There was even a deserted city along the road. It was not likely that he would run into anybody. And this must have seemed absurd to Philip, because there was a revival going on, and God sent him to the desert. And I'm sure he didn't really know why. But you know what? Sometimes God sends us to desert places, and sometimes we might question what is God doing? Does he even know what he's doing? And so he started out. This is incredible to me. Philip just goes. He's just obedient, even when it makes no sense. He hears God's voice, he knows it, and he goes. I've wondered as I read this passage, why does he go? I can only surmise that he trusts God, that he knows what God has done in his past, and he knows that God is trustworthy. He knows his character. It makes me wonder, do I trust God? Do you trust God? Is he trustworthy? Philip was walking a really long way before God gave him the next instruction. God didn't give him all the details. He just told him, go south on the desert road. And he did. He walked from Samaria back down to Jerusalem, which is about 30 miles. And so if he had walked straight without stopping, that would be like 10 solid hours of walking if he was fit and he just kept moving. So this is a lot of walking. And then we don't even know how long it was outside of Jerusalem that he kept going. It was kind of like the Lord was sending him on a pilgrimage, a sort of journey. But on his way, as he was being obedient, as he was walking, he gets his next direction. As he was taking God's invitation and saying, yes, I'm going to go, I'm going to obey. Because God didn't force him to leave. He could have stayed in Samaria, but he chose to accept God's invitation and follow what God was asking him to do. So as he was going and being obedient, God gave his next direction. I don't know if this is exactly what it looks like, but it helped me to picture it a little bit. So God, through the Holy Spirit, tells Philip, go over to that chariot and run up alongside of it. And that's all he tells him, right? He just says, that chariot over there. I mean, I don't know how far away that chariot was. I don't know how fast chariots move, but he's jogging alongside a chariot, right? Seems a little peculiar. But as he gets up there and he's jogging alongside this guy, there's an Ethiopian man. And the Ethiopian man is reading from a really long scroll. It might have been 30 feet long. He's reading the book of Isaiah. The man had just come from Jerusalem to worship, and he was headed back to where he lived. And so he's reading this scroll. And what we know about the Ethiopian man is that he was in charge of the money for this whole region of North Africa. We know that what's most commonly noted in the books of the time, the Greco-Roman literature about these people was their black skin. So this man looked very different than Philip. To most people from that region were considered the ends of the earth. So God was literally sending Philip to touch the ends of the earth by having him walk along this road. Why? Why was God sending him? Because these people had not yet heard the gospel. They hadn't yet heard. So Philip, he's running alongside the chariot, right? And the man is reading the scroll, and he's reading it out loud, which would have been customary. Why, I'm not sure, but that's what they would have done. And so he's reading out loud, and Philip says, "Hey, do you know what you're reading?" And the guy says, "No, how could I? I'm just reading it." And so he invites Philip into the chariot, which must have been a comfort since he's running alongside a chariot, into the chariot so that Philip can explain it to him. So Philip's sitting in the chariot and he's explaining it. God knows what he's doing when he sends us places. God knows what he's doing. He knew exactly what he was doing when he sent Philip to that man, to that chariot. A few Mondays ago, I was in the South Bronx and I was walking into a rundown and sadly crime-ridden government housing complex to meet my friend Bintu, a West African lady who wants to learn English so that she can get a better job and support her kids who are in Africa. She is Muslim and she doesn't yet know Jesus. And as I was walking to this housing complex, I was explaining to the Lord the many things that I had to do that day or could be doing instead of this. And the Lord just asked me, "Do you trust me? Do you trust me? I'm sending you to her." And I said, "Yes, I'll bow my stiff neck again. I'll surrender and I'll trust you with my day, with these hours." And so in I went to her home, a beautiful home, and we sat and studied English, and she started to share her story with me. And I've gone back several times now, and the Lord has just given me great peace. And it's incredible to be able to bring the gospel into those situations as she's learning English. So let's get back to our story. Philip and the Ethiopian man come to water, and Philip has shared enough of the gospel that the Ethiopian not only wants to accept Christ and become a follower of Christ, but he wants to get baptized. So he shared that much of the gospel. And so what happens is they get out of the chariot, Philip baptizes the man, and I have no idea if this is what it looked like. I'm sure it's not. But what we do know is that God then, miraculously, supernaturally, moved Philip to the next spot, a totally different spot. This time he didn't have to walk. It wasn't a pilgrimage thing. He was just like, "You were here, now you're no longer here." I mean, it's kind of comical, but I have no idea what the Ethiopian man, he baptizes him and then he's gone. He just vanishes. What we do know is from history, we know that this man, Irenaeus tells us that this man goes on to start a church planting movement among his people. We know that this man, the Ethiopian eunuch, is the first gospel missionary to this whole region of North Africa. Wow, God knew what he was doing when he sent Philip from the revival going on in Samaria to this man on the desert road. What this man would do. God has a good plan. He had a good plan for Philip, and he has a good plan for you. Just think about Philip's story. Philip faces this incredible trial. One of his 7 close friends his colleagues, he was working together, he was martyred. And as a result, he's forced to move out of Jerusalem into Samaria. But God had a good plan. And it was a plan to redeem his suffering, to give him a place to play in the big story, God's meta-narrative. He started in Samaria, revival breaks out. And then God invites him to go chase after, literally chase after, jogging after a chariot to this Ethiopian man. God doesn't waste our pain, and he doesn't waste our experience and our uniqueness, right? Philip was set up to serve. He had a heart to serve. He was serving in the church, and then God uses him to bring revival, and then God uses him to run alongside and serve this Ethiopian man. God invites us into amazing adventures all around the world. He invited Philip to join in what he was doing, bringing gospel access to Africa by starting with this Ethiopian man. So A.B. Simpson, the founder of the CMA, sent the first alliance missionary to the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1884. Today, there are more than 1.5 million believers in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's incredible. But what about the other places? Has everyone heard the gospel? Of course, you know that that's not the case. There are 3.4 billion people who are unreached. More than 4,000 people have little or no access to the gospel. Practically, that means that for people who have no access to the gospel, they would have to knock on 30,000 doors before they found one person who might be able to tell them a little bit about Jesus. And that's if they were actively seeking. Do you know that 81% of non-Christians worldwide do not know a single Christ follower? Taking all of Jesus to all the world will take all of us. It's not a task reserved for a few. We all have been called to be disciples to all nations. And God is way out ahead of us. He's preparing the fields. He's softening hearts. He's preparing the way. And how? So how are we partnering as the Alliance with what God is doing? I saw your bulletin board outside, so you guys are already presenting this, which is great. But the Alliance Missions has 4 specialized structures. So we have Kama Services, which is doing relief and development in the U.S. and around the world and doing a lot of community development work. We have Marketplace Ministries, so people who are taking their professions and often going into closed access countries where it's very difficult to get a traditional visa and making disciples as they do their regular work. We have Access, which is doing church planting among the least reached peoples of the world. And then we have Envision, which is where I currently serve, which is designed to raise up missional leaders, identify and develop missional leaders in key urban environments. So I want to tell you a few stories. Yes.
Alliance family, this year you sent a record number of new workers to 12 new ministry pathways around the world. One of these new ministry pathways leads to 1 million Rohingya refugees in South Asia who have left their country because of extreme persecution. They fill up the largest refugee camp in the world, facing horrible daily conditions. One woman in the host country was already facing poverty herself and resorted to prostitution in order just to pay the bills and care for her family. Thanks to a partner ministry, she was able to attend a center and learn how to sew. She used those new skills to earn a living and now has a heart to reach out to women around her, Rohingya women who are coming to her country. And new workers that have just been sent are there to walk alongside her. This is just one example of many new pathways that God is opening up for the Alliance. Thank you for your partnership.
So that's one story of what's happening. Another story, let's see. Another story is of Silver Lining. Chris and Lydia were from Hong Kong, and they moved to the U.S. in 1998. They moved to Silicon Valley, California, where Chris was an engineer, and they were living the American dream in many ways. But then in 2005, something happened. Lydia, the wife, she went on a short-term missions trip, and she went to China, and she saw children in orphanages, and she just couldn't shake it. And the Lord called them, and they now live in China. They've been serving there with Marketplace Ministries. They have a ministry in Myanmar, and if any of you were at Life, the youth were, I brought a keychain from Life to support this ministry, but they have homes for children because Myanmar has been just ravaged by civil war that's continuing to go on, and so there's many, many children who've lost both parents, and there is rampant drug abuse. And so if children haven't lost parents to war, they've lost parents to drug abuse. And so they have set up a home for children to come and have a new sense of family. The young girl in the center, she was kidnapped to be a bride for a forced wedding. She escaped, and then she found that she was pregnant. And she subsequently found work as a domestic worker with a Christian family in West Africa. The family heard about a program called Hands of Honor, started by some CMA co-workers of ours at a local Alliance church. And it's a program for young, vulnerable domestic workers in 2 West African countries. Through Hands of Honor, this young girl was able to get the help she needed to process the trauma of all that she had gone through. And you know what? She ended up meeting Jesus. The new baby is in the process of being adopted by a local Christian family. Five years ago, a tea stand appeared outside Jeremy's apartment. The young man at the stand was a university student, and he was studying English. And so Jeremy, an Alliance worker, developed a friendship with him. They would talk about politics and culture and faith. A year later, Jeremy moved to a new city and continued contact with this friend. One time he returned to the city just to visit some people, and so he got in touch with this friend and said, "Hey, let's have lunch." And his friend said, "Can I have a Bible, an English Bible?" And he said, "Sure, I'll try to. I'll go to an Alliance church and see if I can find an English Bible, and in this country in the Middle East." And he gave him an English Bible. He suspected that he wanted the Bible in English. He was learning English, but also so that his family wouldn't know what it was and he could read. And he would text Jeremy and ask him questions from time to time, like, "What does this mean? How do you get free of sin?" And back and forth they would text. And in May of this year, during the month of Ramadan, when Islams are fasting from sunset to sundown, he texted Jeremy and said, "I want to get together with you. I need to see you in person. Can you come to my town?" And so Jeremy said, "Oh, this must be important." So he came to his town. And the first thing the friend said to him was, "I'm not fasting this Ramadan," which is shocking for any Muslim. And so he said, "Let's go to a cafe down the street." And Jeremy thought, "Oh, what's going on?" And so when they got to the cafe, the man said to him, "I came to know Christ, and you're the first person that I wanted to tell because you're the first person who introduced me to him." You know what? Jeremy, he didn't have to chase after a chariot or go on a pilgrim walk like Philip. All he had to do was talk to the man who God literally moved right in front of his house. Right? He moved that tea vendor right in front of his house so that he would come to know him. In New York City, we have the privilege to work with people who've come from all over the world, primarily West Africans in our context, but we're also partnering with some Arabic ministries. And we see in Acts 17 that God moves people for his purposes, right? God moved Philip to reach this Ethiopian man, and God moved Jeremy to the Middle East to then reach this other man and other people, and there's lots of examples. But in New York City, Marie thought she came to the U.S. to go to college, and in fact, she did go to college, but God had another plan. She became terminally ill and was dying when God miraculously healed her about 5 years ago and brought her into relationship with him. In the past year, 4 members of her family in West Africa have come to faith, and 2 recently, in the last 6 months, came to New York City to be baptized. Came from Senegal to New York City to be baptized because she is the one who led them to Christ. Envision New York City has a vision to both develop people like Marie, and there are others like her, within the diaspora, which means people who are scattered from their passport countries and they live someplace else, and leaders outside the diaspora, so interns and teams who come into the city. and see what God is doing in our midst. These are just some of thousands of stories from around the world. There are many stories that are not yet written, but they could be written. Where's your pain? What pain has God redeemed? How has God gifted you? How has He made you unique? What about working as a nurse in Cambodia? Could you do that? What about working as a soccer coach to engage youth in Papua New Guinea? What about teaching English in South Asia? Or church planting along the Silk Road? Could you reach refugees in Europe? Or maybe you dream of being a physical or occupational therapist. Well, they could use you in West Africa. Maybe a community development worker in rural Guinea. Or maybe you can teach ESL here in the Metro New York area. Or reach out to your neighbor, the people who God has moved right to you. Could you be part of writing these stories? Before we finish, I want to return for just a minute to the donuts. What's flowing out of you when pressure comes, or just the everyday? What's flowing out of you? Are there dark places in your soul that need emptying? Sins, soul wounds, or just busyness, loneliness, distraction? Do you need to empty those things so you can be filled with the Holy Spirit? Maybe the question is, are you filled with the Holy Spirit so much so that it's overflowing? Or do you need a refill? I don't know about you, but I want to overflow with the Holy Spirit and serve like Philip did in Samaria and then with the Ethiopian man. So if there are places in your soul that you want empty, or if you want to refill, the Holy Spirit is ready at any moment to do that. God is speaking, and He's giving you an invitation. Will you accept it? There's a spot for each of you. Each one of you, there's a spot. There are stories yet to be told, and those stories include you. You're part of the story. Maybe you're writing the story. Maybe you're written into the story by somebody else, but there are stories that are yet to be told. The invitation has been sent. You may not even know what you're saying yes to. Goodness, Philip did not know what he was saying yes to. He just said yes and started walking down that road. But what you are saying yes to is a God who is good and a God who can be trusted. So will you say yes to join in what God is doing all around the world? Thank you for your time.